one thing I've noticed quite a lot with your work, both visually and sort of, I guess, most obviously in your concrete work, but I guess also in your performance is an emphasis on the letter as a kind of, I guess, the sort of smallest atomic unit of language. And I'm interested in whether this is a conscious thing or whether you have sort of ideas about the letter and how the letter kind of figures into your praxis.
I'm interested in the atomistic nature of language. I think as a side effect of my own scientific interests, I tend to think of language as a kind of molecular phenomenon that's generated from permutations and combinations of tiny little parts. I used to joke that I do in fact have a soul. It's just made of tiny robots, and we're all made of tiny robots in some respects. These fatalistic, deterministic, atomistic bits that somehow cooperate to produce all the complexity we see around us. But I would suggest that depending upon the kind of poem you read, there's a different unit of composition. Certainly if you're a visual poet, probably the smallest unit of composition would be something akin to a Derridian mark, a la Jacques Derrida, a mark. But if you're a lettriste, then it's the letter. If you're a sound poet, it would be the phoneme. If you're somebody like Lyotard, the smallest unit of language would be the phrase. If you're a Saussure, it's the word, right? It constitutes the poetic unit. If you're Charles Olson, it would be the syllable. If you're Ron Silliman, it would be the sentence, right? If you're, Apollinaire, perhaps it's the paragraph, right? If you're Mallarmé, it would be the book. If you're Kenny Goldsmith, it's probably the database, right? These all constitute units of composition that have attached to them their own set of aesthetic sensibilities and attendant concepts of writing. And I think that among my friends in the conceptual writing community, we look upon the concept of writing as a value, trying to probe what constitutes its limits. What can pass for writing in the modern milieu of poetry. And depending upon what you adopt, I think, as your unit of composition, it determines well in advance what can constitute a viable concept of writing. So I think that, sure, you've noticed that in some of the work, the smallest unit of composition might be the letter, but I think that there are other kinds of work that are predicated upon larger units or different scales of units. Certainly, I'm a visual poet, so I think in terms of marks when I'm doing that. I'm a sound poet, so I think in terms of phonemes when I'm doing that. If I'm working with things that are syllabically based or phonetically based, I'm working with smaller units than the word. If I'm trying to write something that's more prosaic in its inflection, I might use larger units like words, phrases, and sentences. They all have their own attendant set of values. And I think that many of the arguments among the avant-garde, if not among traditional poets and more radicalized poets, are predicated upon defining in advance what the smallest atomic unit of writing is.
I think it's a great question. Something I was also curious about. Through your readings tonight, it seems like you can do anything with these atoms, right? I mean, a lot of the poems demonstrate the flexibility of these forms and the way that these little robots can, literally create anything, like a Lego. And while you're reading, we don't get the visual aspect of the poems, and that's another big part of the craft that you're talking about earlier in the technique is, something like in Eunoia, they're exact blocks of text, and a lot of the pieces are, like even the Armory Schaefer piece, there are these incredible forms which you have to assign sort of, performative. You have to decide how to perform them. But while we're sitting in this room, I'm wondering if you can tell us, you can make everything with these letters. I mean, you've made these women around us in this odalisque piece. I wonder if you could tell us what's going on here and how that fits into what you're talking about earlier about, this theory of language and its atoms that you're piecing together, different scales. Okay,
well, these, I think, somewhat juvenile nudes on display here are all derived from a fixed set of curves. There are 21 fundamental shapes used by typographers to design the letters of the alphabet, and there's only 21. What I've done here is actually tried to draw pictures using that fixed repertoire of shapes. And I can scale them, I can rotate them, I can even perhaps overlap them, but I can't flip them or do anything else to modify them. And in doing so, I've tried to, I guess, evoke something difficult to draw, like the female form, in order to find, I guess, the aesthetic beauty of that form within this fractured alphabet, this otherwise broken and smashed up alphabet. And you quickly realize that there's a certain set of constraints that can be imposed upon the manner by which you can draw. And these are some of the, I think, more successful efforts. I've done dozens of these in an effort to see what kinds of potential might be implicit within that fixed set of curves and shapes. I do these kinds of activities as recreation outside of the more onerous labor of the current projects I'm working on. If I need a distraction from something that's more difficult, I might go online and use a toy to build a visual poem just as a lark, something disposable. And I suppose that these works constitute a kind of recreational activity. I'm not so sure that they're perfectly successful as works of visual art. They have, I think, the kind of logo-like character of a corporate symbol, but and I mean, I can't draw worth a damn. But I think that they do expose some of the incipient potential within those 21 shapes.
How crucial, still on, how crucial do you think the explanation of those conceptual parameters is to the reception of these pieces, though? Because, for instance, I really don't think anyone that's seen them thus far knew sort of their method of construction, and I think you're sort of alluding to something that's sort of silly about them. That sort of, I'm sure you wanted them to be taken lightly. You're acknowledging that they have this sort of humorous, sort of commercial logo-like appeal. So what I'm saying is how do you think the understanding of the work might be changed from having understood where you started from in the construction?
Well, I think that any poem or artwork is probably illuminated by the amount of information you have at your disposal, right, in assessing it. I mean, I don't know if it's necessary to actually understand some of the constraints that might be involved in any particular poem in order to be able to appreciate its merits. I mean, it seems to me that if you don't know that information, there might be other traits within the work that are found appealing. I mean, these works are kind of responding to the minimalist usage of curves that somebody like Picasso might use to try and evoke a figure. And how few curves can I use to draw a female form? Can I use 3, 2? I mean, he's trying to evoke these kinds of forms with a very small repertoire of symbols. And I suppose that I'm thinking in those terms, saying if I have these fixed components of letters and alphabet, how can I extract from them a kind of visual appeal that might be recognizable, and it's outside the purview of a textual understanding of those shapes.